today performed deeds by Oscar Wilde. Do not be afraid of the past. If people tell you it is irrevocable, do not believe them. Time and space are merely accidental conditions of thought. The imagination can transcend them.
London, 3rd of April, 1895. Old Bailey Central Criminal Court, Regina versus Queensberry.
The text of the trials are from this book, The Three Trials of Oscar Wilde, by H. Montgomery Hyde, compiled from shorthand notes of the trials. Other sources will be indicated. From the Star.
Not for years has the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey been so densely populated as it was today. People begged, bullied, and bribed for admission.
Sir Edward Clark, the opening speech for the prosecution.
May it please you, my lord, gentlemen of the jury, we are here to try Lord Alfred Douglas, the 8th Marquis of Queensberry.
Will the Marquis of Queensberry please stand?
The charge against him is that he published a false and malicious libel in regard to Mr. Oscar Wilde. The libel was published in the form of a card left by the Marquis at a club to which Mr. Oscar Wilde belonged. It is a visiting card of Lord Queensberry's with his name printed upon it.
The court accepts it as Exhibit A.
The card has written upon it,
Oscar Wilde, Helsing Soundemite.
Of course, it is a matter of serious moment that such a card as this should be in any way connected with a gentleman who has borne such a high reputation in this country.
From the Echo.
Several hours before the day's business opened at the Old Bailey this morning, people were using every effort to gain admission to the Old Court. Never, perhaps, have so many prominent persons been disappointed to find that their prominence would not serve them to gain entrance to a criminal court. Mr. Wilde is a famous artist, considered by many to be amongst the finest writers of this century. He represents a form of artistic literature which recommends itself to the most foremost minds and the most cultivated people. Mr. Wilde was a poet, a novelist, an essayist, and a playwright. His last 4 plays have been great successes in the West End, and 2 of them are currently being performed there.
From the Evening News.
The importance of being early was never better illustrated than at the Old Bailey this morning, when long before 10 o'clock, there was a couple of seats with competitors for it.
The Marquis of Queensberry's claim to fame is that he patronized the man who designed the rules of boxing that bear his name, the Queensberry Rules.
My lord, I object.
Sir Edward, please.
Now, the words of the libel are not directly an accusation of the gravest of all offenses. The suggestion is that there was no guilt of the actual offense, but that in some way or another, the person to whom those words were written did appear, nay, desired to appear, and pose to be a person guilty of or inclined to the commission of the gravest of all offenses. You will appreciate the leaving of such a card openly with a porter of a club is a gravely matter, and will affect the position of the person who the injurious suggestion was made.
From Reynolds' newspaper.
The words written upon the card were of such character as to be unfit for publication.
But the matter does not stop at whether the card was delivered, or whether the defendant can in any way be excused by strong feeling, mistaken feeling, for having made that statement. By the plea which the defendant has put forth, a much graver issue has been raised. In his plea of justification, the defendant has said that the statement is true, and for the public benefit, the statement was made. It is for those who have put into these allegations, these serious allegations, to prove to you, gentlemen of the jury, if they can, by credible witnesses, that there was enough truth to the publication of this libel. And my learned friend has that task.
John Sholto Douglas, Marquis of Queensberry, how do you plead?
I plead not guilty, and also that the libel is true, and that it is for the public benefit that it should be published. I wrote that card with the intention of bringing these matters to a head, having been unable to meet Mr. Wilde otherwise, and to save my son. And I abide by what I wrote.
From the start.
This is, without a doubt, the trial of the century.
Mr. Oscar Wilde, examined by Sir Edward Clark.
I am the prosecutor in this case. I am 39 years of age. My father was Sir William Wilde, surgeon of Dublin and chairman of the Census Commission. I was a student at Trinity College where I took a classical scholarship and the gold medal for Greece. I then went to Magdalen College, Oxford, where I took a classical scholarship, a first in mods, and a first in Greece. There, I also won the New Thicket Prize for English verse. I took my degree in 1878 and came down at once. I have since devoted my life to art and literature. In 1881, I published a volume of poems and then toured and lectured in England and America. In 1884, I married Miss Constance Lloyd, and from that date until now have lived with her in Tite Street, Chelsea. I have 2 sons, the elder of whom will be 10 in June and the second 9 in November.
Mr. Wilde, you have published short stories, fairy tales for children, and the picture of Dorian Gray.
Yes.
You have also toured America and Ireland lecturing on art, or more specifically, what you refer to as the English Renaissance of art.
From a lecture to art students given in New York.
I call it the English Renaissance of art because it is indeed a sort of new birth for the spirit of man. Like the great Italian Renaissance of the 15th century, it possesses a passion for a more comely way of life, a passion for a physical beauty, and a desire for a new form of life, a new imaginative and an intellectual enjoyment. It seeks new forms of poetry, new subjects for art. In art, as in politics, there is but one revolution, one origin to all revolutions. That is a desire on the part of man for a nobler form of life, for a more desire for passion and physical beauty. I believe that this Renaissance will create a brotherhood among men by furnishing a universal language.
Mr. Wilde, you have also written several plays, 2 of which are currently being performed in the West End.
Yes. The importance of being earnest and an ideal husband.
When did you make the acquaintance of Lord Alfred Douglas?
In 1891, he was brought to my house by a friend.
My first meeting with Oscar Wilde was an astonishment.
From the autobiography of Lord Alfred Douglas, written 30 years later.
I had never heard a man talking with such perfect sentences before, as if he had written them all overnight and yet all spontaneous. He did succeed in weaving spells, yet it all seemed to be beauty and power and enchantment. One sat to listen to him enthralled.
From a letter written in January 1893.
My own dear boy, your sonnet is quite lovely, and it is a marvel that those red rose leaf lips of yours should be no less for music of song than for manners of kisses.
From the moment we met, he made up to me in every way possible. He could continually asking me to lunch with him or dine. He flattered me and made much of me in every way.
I know Hyacinthus, whom Apollo loved so madly, was you in Greek days.
I was from the first flattered that a man as so distinguished as he was to pay so much attention and attach much importance to my preferences and views and whims.
Why are you in London? And when do you go to Salisbury? Do go there to cool your hands in the great twilight of Gothic things, and then come here at once. It is a lovely place. It only lacks you. Always with undying love, yours, Oscar.
I will say of him that even if he had never written a line of poetry, he would still be the most wonderful man I ever met.
When did Lord Alfred's father, the Marquis of Queensberry, first object to your relationship with his son?
In April 1894, I saw a letter that he wrote to his son.
This is the letter in question. It was written on Sunday, 1st of April, 1894, at the Carter Hotel. It reads,
Alfred, your intimacy with this man Wilde, it must either cease or I'll disown you. I'm not going to try and analyze your intimacy, and I make no charge. But to my mind, to pose as something is as bad as to be it. With my own eyes, I say you both in the most loathsome and disgusting relationship. Never before have I seen such a sight as that in your horrible features. If I catch you again in any public place, I should shoot him at sight. Your disgusted, so-called father.
To Queensberry, Carter's Hotel, Albemarle Street.
From a telegram written on the 2nd of April.
What a funny little man you are.
If you send me any more such telegrams, or come with any impertinence, I shall give you the thrashing you deserve. If I catch you and my son together again, it will be a scandal that you can little dream of. And I will cut off all supplies of money. So now you know what to expect.
what did you do when you learned that the Marquis of Queensberry first objected to your friendship with his son.
Well, I told him I was perfectly ready to cease the acquaintance if it would make peace between he and his father, but he preferred to do otherwise.
I treat your absurd threats with absolute indifference.
From a letter written the next day.
I have made a point of appearing with Oscar Wilde at many public restaurants. I shall continue to go to any of these places whenever I choose and with whom I choose. If Oscar Wilde was to prosecute you in the criminal courts for outrageous libel, you would get 7 years of penal servitude.
If I thought the actual thing were true, and it became public property, I should shoot him at sight. Right now, I can only accuse him of posing.
If you try to assault me, I shall defend myself with a loaded revolver which I always carry. And if I shoot you or if he shoots you, we should be completely just as if we were acting in self-defense against a dangerous rogue. Think if you were dead, not many people would miss you.
I received your message this morning from post by carters, and I have asked them not to forward anymore, but just to tear them up as they did yours, without reading it. You must be flush of money to waste it on such rubbish.
What happened next?
In October, or at the end of June, there was an interview between Lord Queensberry and myself at my house. Lord Queensberry arrived, not by appointment, at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon with a gentleman with whom I was not acquainted. The interview took place in my library. He said,
Sit down.
I said, I do not allow anyone to talk like that to me in my house or anywhere else. I suppose you have come to apologize to me for those statements you made about me in that letter to your son. I should have the right any day I chose to prosecute you for writing such a letter. He replied,
That letter was privileged, as it was written to my son.
How dare you say such things to him about us?
You were both kicked out of the Savoy Hotel at a moment's notice for your disgusting conduct.
A lie!
And you have taken furnished rooms for him at Piccadilly.
Someone has been telling you an absurd set of lies. I have done nothing of the kind.
I hear you were thoroughly well blackmailed for a letter you wrote my son.
That letter was a beautiful letter, and I never write except for publication. I said to him, Lord Queensberry, do you seriously accuse us of improper conduct? He said,
I do not say you are it, but you look it.
I shall have the course cleared if I do the slightest disturbance again.
You look it and you pose as it, which is just as bad. If I catch you and my son again together in any public place, I shall thrash you.
Well, I do not know what the Queensberry rules are, but the Oscar Wilde rule is to shoot at sight. Leave my house.
I will not.
I will have you put out by the police.
It is a disgusting scandal.
If it be so, then you are the author of the scandal and no one else. I then proceeded to go into my hall and point him out to my servant. This is the Marquis of Queensberry, most infamous brute in London. You are never to allow him to enter my house again.
So far as Lord Queensberry is concerned, in any letter he has written, in any act he has done, he withdraws nothing.
Edward Carson, the attorney for the defense.
He has done all these things with a premeditation and a determination as all risks and hazards to save his son.
His so-called desire to save me is pure hypocrisy.
From the autobiography of Lord Alfred Douglas.
The real object is to persecute my mother and destroy me. My father is an inhumane brute and an atheist.
From a letter Queensberry wrote to his son.
If you are my son, it is only confirming proof to me how right I was to face every horror and misery I have, rather than run the risk of bringing more creatures into the world like yourself. That was the entire and the only reason for my breaking with your mother as a wife. So intensely dissatisfied was I with her as a mother to you children.
My mother divorced him. He harassed her for years and by turns neglected and ill-treated us. He's despicable and mad.
No wonder you have fallen prey to such a brute. I can only feel sorry for you as a human creature.
George Bernard Shaw on the Marquis of Queensberry.
His pretended solicitude for his son and his alleged desire to save him were nothing but hypocritical pretense. He was a Scots Marquis, an Earl, Viscount, and Baron, with a far-felt contempt for public opinion, an ungovernable temper, and, after his divorce, a maniacal hatred for his family. His real objective was to ruin his son, and to finally break the heart of his ex-wife.
My entire family is with you, Oscar. You must prosecute.
From Clark's unpublished memoirs of the trial.
Mr. Wilde, you've told me you're considerably in debt. Who will carry the cost of these proceedings?
My family will be only too delighted to pay for all the necessary costs. My father's been an incubus to us all. We have often discussed the possibility of getting him into a lunatic asylum. My family would be only too delighted to pay for all the costs.
From De Profundis.
Of course, his family never paid for the cost of the trial.
You must all be mad. And if you make inquiries, you will find that this entire town has been reeking of this hideous scandal of Oscar Wilde for the past 3 years.
When was your next encounter with the Marquis of Queensberry?
It was at the St. James Theatre on the opening night of the play, The Importance of Being Earnest. The Marquis booked a seat for the performance.
From a letter to Lord Alfred Douglas.
Dearest Bosie, the Red Scarlet Marquis has made a plot to address the audience on the first night of my play. Henry Bourke revealed it, and I had all of Scotland Yard to guard the theatre. When your father arrived with a prize fighter, the police would not allow him to enter.
The disturbance on the opening night of the new play would be very serious matters for both actor and authors, and it would be especially serious if it had developed into a personal attack on the private character of Mr. Wilde.
He prowled about for 3 hours and then left chattering like some monstrous ape. He left me a grotesque bouquet of vegetables. This, of course, makes his conduct idiotic, robs it of dignity.
The Marquis had done this in another theatre at the opening night of another play. Not one by Mr. Wilde, but one by Tennyson, that dealt with religious issues. At a certain moment in the play, as a character got up and talked about religion, the Marquis got up from his seat and began shouting at the actor on stage. I encourage you to imagine the consequence of such an action on the opening night of a new play. What happened next?
On the 28th of February, I went to the Albemarle Club and received from the porter the card which has been produced.
The court calls Sidney Wright.
I am the hall porter of the Albemarle Club. Mr. and Mrs. Wilde are members of the club. On the 18th of February, the Marquis of Queensberry came to the club and said,
I'm here to see Oscar Wilde.
when I informed him that Mr. Wilde was not here, he wrote a note on a card, handed it to me, and said,
Give that to Mr. Wilde.
On the 28th of February, Mr. Wilde came to the club. I gave him the note, he read it, and appeared very distraught by its content.
Oscar Wilde, Helsing Soundamite.
The Marquis' spelling is somewhat unusual.
From a letter to his friend, Robert Ross, written that night.
Dearest Robbie, something has happened. Bosie's father has left a card at my club with hideous words on it. I can see nothing but criminal prosecution. My whole life seems ruined by this man. I don't know what to do.
Oscar Wilde by Frank Harris, an account of their meeting at the Café Royale.
Oscar, Bernard Shaw is lunching with me tomorrow at the Café Royale. Come at 3 o'clock and meet us there.
George Bernard Shaw.
Wilde came in and told us the story of the conflict. He finished by saying that he was taking the Marquis of Queensberry to court.
I'm bringing an action against Queensberry, Frank, for criminal libel. He is a mere wild beast.
Oscar, you must not do anything of the kind.
My solicitors tell me that some of the things I have written may be brought up against me in court. Now, you know all I have written. Would you, in your position as editor of the Fortnightly, come and give evidence for me, testify that Dorian Gray is not an immoral book?
Yes, I am perfectly willing, and I can say more than that. I can say that you are one of the very few men I have ever known whose acts and whose writings vow away from grossness of any kind.
Oh, Frank, would you?
He was almost in tears.
That would be most kind of you. Your evidence will win the case.
Anything I can do, Oscar, I will do with pleasure. But I want you to consider the matter carefully. An English law court is all well and good for 2 average men fighting an ordinary business dispute. That is what it is made for. But to ask the court to judge the morality or immorality of an artist is to ask it to do what it is unhopefully fit to do.
My solicitors tell me I shall win.
Solicitors live on quarrels. Let us begin by putting the law courts out of the question. But don't forget that if you lose and Queensberry goes free, everyone will hold that you have been guilty of nameless vice. The Crown could charge you with gross indecency, and you could go to prison for 2 years. But surely you must know you could go to prison.
But Frank...
You must remember that you are a standard bearer for future generations. You are an artist and a revolutionary. If you lose, you will make it harder for all writers in England. God knows it's hard enough already. But you will put the hands of the clock back by 50 years.
What should I do?
You should go abroad. And as Ace of Trumps, you should take your wife with you.
You are right, of course, Frank. You know it's Bosie who wants me to fight his father.
Let Queensberry and his son fight their own miserable quarrels. They are well matched.
Oh, Frank, how could I do that?
I think it was about this time that Bosie Douglas came in.
The day of the lunch at the Cafe Royale, I was very anxious that the case against my father would proceed, and I resented any arguments in favor of its abandonment. I was terribly afraid that Oscar would weaken and throw up a sponge.
At Oscar's request, Terrace repeated his argument, and to my astonishment, Douglas got up at once and said,
Such advice shows you are no friend of Oscar.
What do you mean?
He turned and left the room on the spot. Then Oscar got up and said,
It is not friendly of you, Frank. It really is not friendly.
and he too left the room.
I turned to Shaw and said, did I say anything in the heat of argument that would have offended either Oscar or Douglas?
Nothing, not a word. You have nothing to reproach yourself with.
I stormed out of the restaurant because I feared I might not be able to convince you and Mr. Shaw, and that you would weaken Wilde and take him out of the state of mind that I had gotten him into.
You reptile!
Once Douglas left, I was suddenly struck by a sort of likeness, a similarity of expression between Lord Alfred Douglas and his unhappy father. I could not get it out of my head. That little face blanched with rage, those wild, hating eyes, and that voice too was Queensberry's.
You are no son of mine, and I never thought you were!
One thing was clear from our meeting. Lord Alfred Douglas had set his mind on Oscar Wilde prosecuting his father. It seemed as if he knew exactly what was to be done.
Sir Edward, you must promise faithfully you will put me in the box and allow me to testify against my father. From the autobiography of Lord Alfred Douglas. If not, you might as well throw up the case at once.
Make your mind at rest, Lord Alfred. I know nothing else but to do that. My idea of the way to conduct this case is to launch out at the very outset with a personal attack on Lord Queensberry, which we have ample proof in his letters to you.
Yes, but you must promise faithfully you will put me in the
I
witness box.
promise you I will. You should go into the box immediately after my opening speech.
From the unpublished memoirs of the trials by Sir Edward Clark.
I made no such agreement or promise.
A warrant for the arrest of Lord Sholto Douglas, 8th Marquis of Queensberry, was issued the next day.
In his plea of justification, submitted by the Marquis of Queensberry, he had said that the statement made in the card is true, and it was for the public benefit that it was made. In support of this plea, he puts forth, amongst other things, the following proof.
The Cadogan Hotel. There, Lord Alfred Douglas had taken the room. While there, he wrote to the Evening News about his spectacular withdrawal from the case.
It would have been impossible for me to have proved my case without putting Lord Alfred Douglas in the witness box against his father. Lord Alfred was extremely anxious to go in the box, but I would not allow him to do so. Rather than place him in so painful a position, I determined to retire from the case and to bear on my own shoulders whatever ignominy and shame might result from my prosecuting Lord Queensberry.
Will testify under oath that Mr. Oscar Wilde solicited their services in committing acts of the grossest indecency. You will hear from Charles Parker. He will tell you that Mr. Wilde committed acts of gross indecency with him. You will hear from Alfred Wood. He, too, will tell you that Mr. Wilde paid him to commit these acts with him. You will hear from William Parker. You will hear from Sidney Neighbor. You will hear from Fred Atkins. You will hear these men testify that Mr. Wilde committed acts of the grossest indecency with them. You will hear from their lips.
At this point, Clark was seen to leave the court with Wilde. From Lord Alfred Douglas by H. Montgomery High.
Mr. Wilde, it is almost impossible, in view of all the circumstance, to induce a jury to convict of a criminal offense a father who was merely endeavoring to save his son from an evil companionship. I see no hope at all of a guilty verdict. Moreover, if these men testify, the Crown could use their testimony to start legal action against you for gross indecency. If you want to avoid this, you must drop the charge against the Marquis at once. I advise you in your own interest to allow me to make a statement to this effect in court, and will allow me to withdraw from prosecution.
I agree with your advice.
If you wish it, I'll keep the case going and give you ample time to get to Calais. There is no necessity for your presence in court while the announcement is being made.
No, I shall stay.
Clark subsequently wrote in his unpublished memoirs of the trial.
I hoped and expected he would go out of the country, and I believed he would have no difficulty in doing so. The authorities were quite willing he should go abroad.
Wilde chose to remain in court while Clark made his statement.
I shall stay.
The wonder is not that the gossip reached Lord Queensberry, but that after it was known this man Wilde should have been tolerated in society for the amount of time he has. At this point, Sir Edward Clark was seen to pluck Mr. Carson by the gown. He then interposed and asked leave of the judge to consult with his learned friend. After a few moments of whispered conversation, Mr. Carson returned to his seat.
May I claim your lordship's indulgence while I interpose to make this statement?
Yes, you may, Sir Edward.
I think it must be present in your lordship's mind that those who represent Mr. Wilde in this case have before us a very terrible anxiety. We cannot conceal from ourselves that the evidence that has been submitted might induce a jury to say that Lord Queensberry, in using the word posing, was using a word for which there was sufficient justification. Under these circumstances, I hope your lordship will think I am taking the right course, which I do so after confirming with Mr. Wilde. I feel that we could not resist a verdict of not guilty in this case, not verdict having reference to the word posing. With this in mind, I now interpose and say on behalf of Mr. Wilde that I ask to withdraw from the prosecution. I hope and trust this will make an end to the case.
I do not know that I have any right whatever to interfere in the application that my learned friend has made. I can only say, as far as Lord Queensberry is concerned, that if there is a verdict of not guilty, this verdict must include that his plea of justification has been proved.
Sir Edward, I understand you to assent to a verdict of not guilty, and the jury will return
The verdict will be that the plea of justification has been proved, and that the words were published for the public benefit.
Yes, Mr. Carson.
Gentlemen of the jury, do you find the plea of justification has been proved?
Yes, we do.
And do you find the defendant not guilty?
Yes.
And that is a verdict of you all?
Yes.
And also that it was published for the public benefit?
Yes.
Of course, the cost for the defense will follow,
Yes.
and Lord Queensberry may be discharged.
He may be discharged. The court is adjourned.
From the Echo.
And so, a most miserable case is ended. The Marquis of Queensberry is triumphant, and Mr. Oscar Wilde is damned and done for. He may now change places with the Marquis and go into the dock himself.
Outside the court, prostitutes were dancing on the pavement, capering joyfully about lifting their skirts at the downfall of one whom they considered a competitor in trade. At least he'll have his hair cut regular now.
What a filthy business.
From Oscar Wilde by H. Montgomery Hyde.
I shall not feel clean for weeks.
What happens now?
We wait and see if the Crown will prosecute you.
From the Daily Telegraph.
No certain rebuke could have been well inflicted on some of the artistic tendencies of our time than the condemnation of Oscar Wilde at the Central Criminal Court.
Within minutes of his acquittal, the Marquis of Queensberry dispatched this letter to the Crown's Director of Prosecutions.
To the Director of Public Prosecutions. Dear Sir, in order that there may be no miscarriage of justice, I think it my duty at once to send you a copy of all our witnesses' statements, together with the shorthand notes of the trial.
This step placed the authorities under obligation to act at once. From the National Observer.
There is not a man or woman in the English-speaking world who is not under a debt of gratitude to the Marquis of Queensberry for destroying the high priest of the decadence. This is what art leads to.
On the same day, because of this letter, the Crown decided to issue a warrant for Wilde's arrest.
From the National Observer. There must be another trial at the Old Bailey and of the decadence and of their hideous conceptions of the meaning of art. There must be an absolute end.
Oscar Wilde was charged with violation of Section 2 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act, signed 1st of January 1885 by Queen Victoria.
Any male person who, in public or in private, commits or is party to the commission of or procures the commission by any male person of any act of gross indecency shall be guilty of a misdemeanor. I appeal now to the champions of individual rights.
George Bernard Shaw on the amendment.
There is no justification for that law except the old theological one, making the secular arm the instrument of God's vengeance.
Queen Victoria.
And shall be guilty of a misdemeanor, and, being convicted thereof, shall be liable at the discretion of the court, to be imprisoned for any term not exceeding 2 years, with or without hard labor.
When asked to sign this bill, the Queen was warned by one of her advisors that,
The bill does not include similar behavior between women.
to which she replied,
Women don't do such things.
the bill was signed at once. It remained in effect until 1967.
From court, Oscar Wilde went to the Cadogan Hotel, where Lord Alfred Douglas had taken a room. There he wrote to the Evening News about his spectacular withdrawal from the case.
It would have been impossible for me to have proven my case without putting Lord Alfred Douglas in the witness box against his father. Lord Alfred was extremely anxious to go in the box, but I would not allow him to do so. Rather than placing him in so painful a position, I have determined to retire from the case, and to bear on my own shoulders whatever ignominy and shame might result from my prosecuting Lord Queensberry.
But nobody really believed this. Robert Sherard's Life of Oscar Wilde. At the Cadogan Hotel, Wilde was advised by everyone to go at once to Dover and catch a boat train to Calais.
The authorities were quite willing that he should go abroad.
From Clark's unpublished memoirs of the trial.
As it was, the warrant was issued only after 5 p.m. to allow him plenty of time to get to Calais. From Oscar Wilde by Frank Harris.
At the Cadogan Hotel, an angry mob had assembled in the street. Inside, Wilde sat as if glued to his chair and drank hock and seltzer steadily in almost unbroken silence.
If the country allows you to leave, all the better for the country.
From a note sent to the Cadogan Hotel.
But if you take my son with you, I will follow you wherever you go and shoot you.
Oscar's wife, on hearing the court's decision, said,
I hope Oscar is going away abroad.
I shall stay and do my sentence, whatever that may be.
He then lapsed into an action.
Oscar, I will go to the House of Lords and talk to my cousin. I'll see if he can use his influence to prevent a prosecution.
With what a crash this fell. I thought of nothing but to defend him from his father. I thought of nothing else, and...
That was all he said.
At 6:10, 2 detectives came to the hotel. Wilde looked right in the face. Charles Richards.
I went with Sergeant Allen to the Cadogan Hotel. I saw Mr. Wilde there. I said, Mr. Wilde, we are police officers and hold a warrant for your arrest.
Yes, where shall I be taken?
You will have to come with me to Scotland Yard and then to Bow Street.
Can I have bail?
I don't think you can. I then conveyed the prisoner to Scotland Yard.
Oscar Wilde was in prison on the 5th of April, and the trial was set for the 25th of April, 1895.
You know, I have not much to do with distinguished people, but I received a very nice letter from Lord Claude Hamilton and a kind telegram from Mr. Charles Danby, the actor, with hearty congratulations, etc. A pile of letters waits for me at the National Observer, and various clubs have telegraphed also. Here's the message. Every man in the city is with you. Kill the bugger!
Scotland Yard and then to Bow Street.
Can I have bail?
I don't think you can. I then conveyed the prisoner to Scotland Yard.
Oscar Wilde was in prison on the 5th of April, and the trial was set for the 25th of April, 1895.
You know, I have not much to do with distinguished people, but I received a very nice message from Lord Claude Hamilton and a letter from Mr. Charles Danby, the actor, with hearty congratulations, etc. A pile of letters waits for me at the National Observer, and several clubs have telegraphed also. Here's a message. Every man in the city is with you. Kill the bugger!
We have here with us Professor Marvin Taylor, Wilde Scholar at New York University, and co-editor of the book Reading Wilde. Mr. Taylor, would you tell us the thing that you find most interesting about the trials?
Well, to me, the thing that's most interesting about the trials of Oscar Wilde is there's a whole nexus of issues that are going on, and they have to do with the role of art, with effeminacy, with homosexuality, with Irish England, with class. It's not just the... See, the sodomy charges are really the less important. See, I feel that what he was really being tried for was his subversive beliefs about art, about morality, about Victorian society. Well, what happens, he comes heads on up against legal discourse, and I would even say legal medical discourse. And he begins to lose this sort of patriarchal medical discourse that makes him look like a homosexual as opposed to someone who has attraction for other men.
Are you saying that Wilde didn't really think of himself as homosexual?
Did Wilde consider himself a type of person? See, that's what I think is interesting about the Wilde trials too. It's not just that it is after the Wilde trials that people began identifying themselves as a specific type of person by what type of attraction they had for people of the same sex. So did Wilde consider himself that type of person? There's nothing in Greek and Roman literature that says the Greeks and Latins thought of themselves as homosexuals. So there's nothing that Wilde would have read that would have necessarily made him construct that identity. See, Foucault talks about how it was impossible for men of the Victorian era to think of themselves as gay/homosexual because that construction did not exist.
Well, that leads me to my next question. Why isn't Wilde telling the truth about his desire for men?
Moises, this is the thing. Wilde was less interested in admitting that he had sex with men than he was in promoting his own artistic ideas, his ideas about art and about beauty. Though it does look like he lied. I mean, either we have that feeling or we're projecting. Do we want Oscar to be gay and therefore we're projecting that lying? I don't know. It seems more complicated to me, but I can see it both ways. I project too much that Oscar was lying, and then you raise an ethical question.
Which is?
Was it wrong for him to be up on the stand and to say that Dorian Gray was a beautiful personality? To him, Dorian was a personality. That's what he was attracted to.
What do you think is the answer?
Do I judge him by his own standards? Or by the standards of the courtroom? Or by the standards of later gay deliberations? They take him up as a model, but inevitably find him unsatisfactory if they pursue it for very long, because he was something else. See, Wilde was an asset. That is, an artist who argues strenuously for the aesthetic approach. He bases it on Hellenism and its long tradition of art for art's sake. And as long as he's able to maintain control of discourse, then he's incredibly successful. So, yes, it does look like he lied. But I'm on very slippery moral ground. Ethically, it does not bother me that he lied. Alas, what they were trying to do, I think, was to fix homosexuality, to contain this disruption which Wilde represented. And it was a disruption of all kinds of things, of class, of gender, of sexuality, of Victorian society. And they were very successful. But as you know, he had already released these ideas into Western culture that are still there.
From Oscar Wilde, a summing up by Lord Alfred Douglas.
After Oscar's arrest, immediate ruin followed. He had two plays, An Ideal Husband and The Importance of Being Earnest, playing in West End. He had been up till a week before the trial, a comparatively rich man. Yet the moment he was arrested, he was reduced to penury and assailed by all his creditors in a body while all his income simply stopped. He was, of course, condemned to pay all the costs for my father. An execution was put on his house, and his furniture and effects were sold for a song.
Sold!
Oscar, I know I always advise you to fight against my father, but I'm not impervious to reason. Had I known that you're only cutting your own throat and playing to my father's hands, Oscar, I never intended for this to happen.
The real tragedies in life occur in such an inartistic manner that they hurt us by their crude violence, their absolute incoherence, their absurd want of meaning.
On the day Oscar Wilde was arrested, 600 gentlemen left England for the continent, on a night when usually 60 people traveled. Every train to Dover was crowded, every steamer to Calais thronged with members of the aristocratic and leisured classes.
Oscar and his legal advisors urged me to go to France before the second trial. They assured me that my presence in the country could only do Oscar harm. Also that Edward Carson is defending him for no cost would throw up his defense. I embarked for France on the 25th of April, 1895. It would be 2 years before I was to see him again.
London, 26th of April, 1895. Old Bailey Central Criminal Court. Regina versus Wilde. Opening speech for the prosecution, Mr. Charles Gill.
May it please you, my lord, gentlemen of the jury, this case has received much attention in the press. I must beg you to dismiss from your minds anything you may have read or heard about the prisoner. You must approach this case with absolutely open minds, carefully and impartially. The charge against Mr. Oscar Wilde is that he committed acts of gross indecency with the following male persons: Charles Parker, Frederick Atkins, Sidney Mavor, and Alfred Wood.
Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde, do you plead guilty or not guilty?
I plead not guilty.
George Bernard Shaw on the plea of not guilty.
Wilde could plead not guilty with perfect sincerity, and indeed could not honestly put in any other plea. You see, guilty or not guilty is a question not of fact, but of morals. The prisoner who pleads not guilty is not alleging that he did this or did not do that. He is affirming that what he did does not involve any guilt on his part. A man rightly accused of homosexuality is perfectly entitled to say that he is not guilty in the legal sense. He might admit that he was guilty of a breach of local law, and his own conscience might tell him that he was guilty of a sin against the moral law. But if he believed, as Wilde most certainly did, that homosexuality is not a crime, then he is perfectly entitled to say that he is not guilty of it.
Gentlemen, the prisoner is well known as a dramatic author and generally as a literary man of unusual attainments. However, we must bear in mind the terrible risks involved in certain literary phases of the day. I will begin by reading to the jury the transcripts of the trial of Oscar Wilde versus the Marquis of Queensberry, specifically the cross-examination of Wilde on literature, the chameleon, and Dory.
My lord, I do not think it fair, Mr. Gill, to insist upon reading this. It is not fair to judge a man by his books.
So this is examination as to character.
You may proceed, Mr. Gill.
The following is from the transcripts of the first trial. Mr. Carson asked Mr. Wilde, "You are of the opinion, I believe, there is no such thing as an immoral book?" Mr. Wilde replied, "Yes." Carson, "Am I right in saying you do not consider the effect in creating morality or immorality?" Wilde, "In writing a play or book, I am concerned entirely with literature, that is, with art."
Art has a spiritual ministry. It can raise and sanctify everything it touches, and popular disapproval must not impede its progress. Art is what makes the life of each citizen a sacrament. Art is what makes the life of the whole race immortal.
From the English Renaissance of art.
The arts are the only civilizing influences in this world, and without them, people are barbarians. An aesthetic education which humanizes people is far more important even to politicians than an economic education, which does the opposite.
Carson asked, "Is that good for the young?" Wilde, "Anything is good that stimulates thought in any age."
Children should not be drilled in that calendar of infamy they call European history, but should learn in a workshop how art might offer a new history of the world, with a promise of the peace of man, of brotherhood among men, of praise of God's penmanship, of new imagination and new beauty.
Carson asked, "I take it no matter how immoral a book might be, if it is well written, it would be, in your opinion, a good book." Wilde, "Yes, if it were well written so as to produce a sense of beauty."
With the English Renaissance of art, I hope to create an artistic movement that might change, as it has changed, the face of England. As time goes on, men and forms of expression will change, but the principle remains. The object of art is to stir the most divine and remote chords which make music in our soul. Man is hungry for beauty. There is a void. We spend our days looking for the secrets of life, or the secret of life is in art.
Carson asked, "Whether moral or immoral?"
I-
Wilde, "There is no such thing as morality in thought."
I have never come across anyone in whom the moral sense was dominant, who was not heartless, cruel, vindictive, large, stupid, and entirely lacking in the smallest sense of humanity. Moral people, as they are termed, are simple beasts. I would sooner have 50 unnatural vices than one unnatural virtue. The real enemy of modern life, of everything that makes life joyous and pure and colored for us, is Puritanism and the Puritan spirit. There lies the great enemy of the modern age. Puritanism is not a theory of life. is simply an explanation of the English middle class.
Carson, let us go over it phrase by phrase. I quite admit that I adored you madly.
Whenever a community or a government tries to dictate to the artist what he is to do, art either entirely vanishes or becomes stereotyped or degenerates into some low or ignoble form of craft. The type of government that is most suitable to the artist is no government at all.
Carson, do you mean to say that that passage describes the natural feeling of one man towards another?
Modern morality consists in accepting the standards of one's age. I consider that for any man to accept the standards of his age is the grossest immorality. It would be the influence produced by a beautiful personality.
Dear Oscar, I've just arrived here.
Douglas writes from the Hotel des Deux Mondes in Paris.
They're very nice here, and I can stay as long as I like without paying my bill, which is a good thing as I'm quite penniless. The proprietor asked after it once and expressed his regret and indignation at the treatment you are receiving. Do keep up your spirit, my dearest darling. I continue to think of you day and night and send you all my love. Yours, Bosie.
I will now proceed to question the men with whom Mr. Wilde is accused to have committed the acts of gross indecency. I ask you to pay close attention to the testimony of these boys.
The court calls Charles Parker.
Please state your age.
I am 21 years of age.
Do you have family in London?
I have a brother with
What is your occupation?
I have been engaged as a valet and my brother as a groom.
When did you first meet Mr. Alfred Taylor?
In the beginning of 1893, I was out of employment. One day, I was with my brother in the St. James's restaurant in the bar. While there, Taylor came up and spoke to us. He was an entire stranger. He passed the compliments of the day and asked us to have a drink. We got into conversation with him. He spoke about men.
In what way?
He called attention to the prostitutes who frequent the Piccadilly Circus and remarked, "I can't understand sensible men wasting money on painted trash like that. But many do though, and there are few who know better. Now you can get money in a certain way easily enough if you cared to." I understood to what Taylor alluded and made a close reply.
I'm obliged to ask you what it was you actually said.
I do not like to say.
You were less squeamish at the time, I dare say. I asked you for the words.
I said that if any old gentleman with money took a fancy to me, then I was agreeable. I was agreeable. I was terribly hard up.
What did Taylor say?
Taylor asked us to visit him. He said that he could introduce us to a man who was good for plenty of money. If we were interested, we were to meet him, Taylor, at the St. James's Bar. We went there the next evening and were shown upstairs into a private room in which there was a dinner table laid for four. After a while, Wilde came in, and I was formally introduced. I had never seen him before, but I had heard of him. We dined about 8 o'clock. We all four sat down to dinner, Wilde sitting on my left.
Who made the fourth?
My brother, William Parker. I had promised Taylor that he should accompany me.
Was the dinner a good dinner?
Yes. We had plenty of champagne with dinner, and brandy and coffee afterwards. Wilde paid for the dinner.
What happened after dinner?
Wilde said to me, "This is the boy for me. Will you go to the Savoy Hotel with me?" I consented, and Wilde drove me in a cab to the hotel.
Well, let us know what occurred there.
Wilde committed the act of sodomy upon me.
Professor Taylor went on to say, from this moment on, Oscar Wilde would not be associated with Hellenism or aestheticism or revolutionary artistic ideals, but with homosexuality. He would become the body type. He would become the body type of the third sex or whatever, sociological or medical terms with a modern homosexual from that moment on.
Did Wilde give you any money that night?
Before I left, Wilde gave me £2, telling me to call up the Savoy Hotel within a week. I did about a week afterwards at 11 o'clock at night. We had dinner with champagne, and before I left, Wilde gave me £3.
What happened at that occasion?
I was asked by Wilde to imagine that I was a woman and that he was my lover. I had to keep up this illusion. I used to sit on his knees, and he used to, as a man might amuse himself with a girl.
Apart from money, did Wilde give you anything else?
Yes, he gave me a silver cigarette case and a gold ring. I don't suppose that boys are different from girls in acquiring presents from them who are fond of them.
The cross-examination of Charles Parker by Sir Edward Clarke.
Did you state at Bow Street that you received £30 from a gentleman to not accuse him of sodomy with you?
Yes, I stated at the part of the money is extorted from a gentleman with whom I had committed acts of indecency. I met the
I don't ask the name of the gentleman with whom the money was extorted, but I do ask the name of the gentleman from whom you committed the acts of indecency and got the money for it.
Alfred Wood and John Allen.
When had the indecency occurred in consequence of which you received the £30? How long before?
I cannot think.
You had indecent behavior with the gentleman in question.
Yes, but only on one occasion.
Did the gentleman come into your room
Yes.
by your invitation?
He asked me if he could come.
And you took him home with you?
Yes.
Then Wood and Allen came into the room while the gentleman was there.
Yes.
And they threatened the gentleman with divulging what they had seen.
Yes.
How much did Wood and Allen tell you they got?
I could not remember.
Try and remember.
£300 or £400.
Now, you positively say that Mr. Wilde committed sodomy with you at the Savoy.
Yes.
But you have been in the habit of accusing other
Never,
gentlemen of the same
unless it
offense.
has been done.
I submit that you blackmailed gentlemen.
No, sir. Wood and Allen did that.
When Taylor asked you if you ever went with men and got money for it, did you understand what he meant?
Yes.
You had heard of such things before.
Yes.
You understood the practices you were about to enter upon.
Yes.
So you were in no way corrupted by Mr. Wilde.
No.
Nothing more with this witness.
From De Profundis.
Why do they jeer at me? I never did them any harm. I never tried to be anything but kind to them.
From a letter to Paris.
Oscar, these men are being maintained at Chiswick by the Crown. They have been receiving £5 per week from the beginning of your prosecution of my father until now. Charles Parker even received a brand new suit of clothes at the Crown's expense.
The court calls Alfred Wood.
When did you first meet Alfred Taylor?
In January 1893.
When did you move into his house?
In January 1893. I was out of a job and I had nowhere to go.
How long did you stay there?
I lived with him for 3 weeks.
Where did you sleep?
In the same room with Taylor. There was only one bed there.
What took place when you were introduced to Wilde?
I went to the Café Royal at 9 o'clock one evening. Mr. Wilde was sitting down. He spoke to me first. He asked, "Are you Alfred Wood?" I said yes. Then he invited me to get something to drink. I had something, then we dined in a private room.
What kind of meal was it?
Very nice, one of the best to be got.
What wine did you have?
Champagne.
What happened after dinner?
After dinner, I went with Mr. Wilde to 16 Tite Street.
Isn't that where he lives with his wife and 2 children?
Yes, but there was no one in the house to my knowledge.
From an ideal husband.
People ask me, why were you so weak to yield to temptation? Weak! I'm sick of hearing that word, weak. Do they really think that it is weakness that yields to temptation? I tell you, they are terrible temptations, that it requires strength and courage to yield to stake all one's life on a single moment, to risk everything at one throw. There's no weakness in that. There is a terrible, horrible temptation and courage. I had that courage.
Mr. Wilde let himself in with a latchkey. There we went up to a room where we had all seltzer. Then, after the grossest indecency occurred, Mr. Wilde made me nearly drunk.
Did Wilde give you any money that night?
Yes, at the Florence, about £3, I think.
Has he given you anything else?
He bought me some presents. He bought me half a dozen shirts, some collars, and handkerchiefs, and a silver watch and chain.
The cross-examination of Alfred Wood by Sir Edward Clarke.
Did you go to America?
Yes,
When?
in 1893,
When did you return?
the following year.
What have you been doing since your return from America?
Well, I've not done much.
Have you done anything?
I cannot get any employment.
I thought not. As a matter of fact, you've had no respectable work for over 3 years.
Well, no.
Charles Parker has told me that you and a man named Allen obtained £300 to £400 from a gentleman whom you blackmailed, and he gave you £30. Is that true?
I didn't get the money. It wasn't paid to me.
Well, tell us, did you get £300 from this blackmail?
Not me. Alan did.
You were a party to it.
I was there, yes.
Do you mean by that you came into the room while the gentleman was there with Parker?
Not me. Alan went in first.
At all events, Allen and you got £300 to £400 from that gentleman.
Yes.
How much did you get?
£175.
What for?
Well, it was given me by Alan.
Nothing more with this witness.
From De Profundis.
People think it dreadful of me to have dined at supper with these men, to have found pleasure in their company. But from my point of view, they were delightfully suggestive and stimulating. It was like feasting with panthers. They were to me like the brightest of gilded snakes. Their poison was part of their perfection. I did not know that when they were to strike at me, it was to be at another's piping and another's pay.
The court calls Fred Atkins.
How old are you?
I'm 20 years old.
What is your business?
I have been a billiard marker. I've also been a bookmaker's clerk and a comedian.
What do you do?
I currently am unemployed.
Who introduced you to the prisoner?
I was introduced to Mr. Taylor by a young fellow named Wilde in November 1892. We went to a dinner and I met Mr. Wilde there.
What happened at the dinner?
Mr. Wilde kissed the waiter.
Did you go to Paris with him?
Yes, we were seated at the table. Mr. Wilde put his arm around me, said he liked me. I arranged to meet him 2 days afterwards at Victoria Station and went with him to Paris as his private secretary.
Did any indecencies happen between you and Mr. Wilde in Paris?
No. Once, though, I got back to the rooms very late. Mr. Wilde was in bed. I went into Mr. Wilde's room to have myself a drink. There was a young man about 22 years of age in bed with Mr. Wilde. It was Mr. Schwab. In the morning, Mr. Wilde came into my room and he said, "Shall I come into bed with you?" I replied, "It was time to get up." Mr. Wilde did not get into bed with me. I returned with him to London and he gave me some money and a silver cigarette case.
The cross-examination of Fred Atkins by Sir Edward Clark.
Mr. Atkins, did any impropriety ever take place between you and Mr. Wilde?
Never.
You say Mr. Wilde attempted to come to bed with you.
Yes.
Have you been engaged in the business of blackmailing?
I don't remember.
Think.
I never got money in that way.
That being your answer, I must particularize. Do you know the name of the gentleman with whom Charles Parker was engaged in gross indecency?
No.
On the 9th of June, 1891, did you obtain a large sum of money from that gentleman?
Certainly not.
Now I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I hope that you be careful in your reply. Were you ever taken to Rochester Road Police Station?
No.
My lord, I wish to call Police Constable 936A.
Police Constable 963A is present.
Now, I ask you in the presence of this officer, was a statement made at the police station that you and the gentleman had been in bed together?
I don't think so.
Think before you speak. It'll be better for you. Did not the landlady actually come to the room and see you and the gentleman naked and in bed together?
I don't remember that she did.
You may as well tell us. I have your statement in my hand. Did not the landlady come into the room at that point?
Well, yes, she did.
You had endeavored to force money on this
I
gentleman.
asked him for some money.
At the police station, the gentleman refused to prosecute.
Yes.
So you were liberated.
Yes.
Atkins, I just asked you these very questions, and you swore upon your oath that you had not been in custody at all, and never taken to Rochester Road Police Station. How came you to tell me these lies?
I did not remember it.
Nothing more with this witness.
From Dave Profundus.
I don't regret for a single moment having lived for pleasure. I did it to the full as one should do anything as one does. I wanted to eat of all the fruit, of all the trees in the garden of the world. I lived on honeycomb.
The court calls Sidney Maver.
Mr. Maver, how did you meet Mr. Wilde?
One day, Taylor said to me, "I know a man of great influential position who will be of great use to you. He likes young men who are modest and nice in appearance. I'll introduce you." I was then asked to dine at Kettner's restaurant the following evening. I was led into a private room, and Taylor said to me, "Mr. Wilde likes nice, clean boys." That was the first time Wilde's name was mentioned.
What happened next?
We were brought into a private room. Mr. Wilde entered with another gentleman. I believe the gentleman's name was Lord Alfred Douglas.
From the autobiography of Lord Alfred Douglas.
Before I left for Paris, I happened to see Maver at the Bow Street Police Court. Maver was a gentleman by birth and of an entirely different class than the other so-called witnesses.
We were then seated next to Mr. Wilde, who used occasionally to pull my ear or chuck me under the chin, but did nothing that was actually objectionable. And Mr. Wilde said to Taylor, "Our lad has nice clean manners. We must see more of him." I was then giving my address to Mr. Wilde, who sent me a silver cigarette case. It was inscribed "To Sydney from O.W., October 1893.
I went up to him, shook hands, and said, "Sidney, surely you are not going to give evidence against Oscar."
I soon afterwards received a letter from Mr. Wilde asking to meet him at the Armel Hotel. I went there for dinner and arrived soon after 8. We went to a private room and dined. I then subsequently stayed the night.
Sidney!
Well, what can I do? They have a statement out of me. If I refuse to prosecute now, they shall put me in prison.
For God's sake, Sid, remember, you are a public school boy. Don't put yourself on the level with Parker and Atkins. When counsel asks you questions, deny the whole thing and say you were frightened by the police. They can't do anything to you.
Did any misconduct take place that night?
No. No misconduct ever took place between Mr. Wilde and me.
Mr. Maver, I repeat the question. Did any misconduct take place that night?
No. No misconduct ever took place between Mr. Wilde and me.
Counsel, of course, dropped him like a hot brick.
Nothing more with this witness. That is the case for the Crown, my lord.
Second trial, fourth day, Tuesday, 30th of April, 1895. Opening speech for the defense, Sir Edward Clark.
This trial seems to be operating as an act of indemnity for all the blackmailers in London. In testifying on behalf of the Crown, these men have received immunity for past rogueries and indecencies. These men who ought to be the accused and not the accusers. You must not act upon suspicion or prejudice, but upon the facts. And gentlemen, on the facts, I respectfully argue that Mr. Wilde is entitled to claim from you an act of acquittal. It was Mr. Wilde's act, and Mr. Wilde's act alone, in charging Lord Queensberry with libel, which has brought the matter before the public, and placed him in his present position of peril. Men who have been charged with the offenses alleged against Mr. Wilde shrink from investigation. Mr. Wilde taking the initiative of a public trial is evidence of his innocence. Nor is that all. A few days before the first trial, notice was given of certain charges made against him with these names of these young men. Mr. Wilde chose to stay and face these allegations. What would you think of a man who, knowing himself to be guilty, and that evidence would be forthcoming from a half dozen different places, insist upon bringing this case before the world? Insane would hardly be the word for it if he really had been guilty and yet faced that investigation.
The examination of Oscar Wilde by Sir Edward Clark.
With reference to the Queensberry trial, was the evidence you gave on that occasion absolutely and in all respects true?
Entirely true evidence.
And what part of what these youths have said is true?
I have been acquainted with all of them, but nothing ever happened with any one of them.
Of what Charles Parker said, what is untrue?
Well, he says he came to the Savoy Hotel with me and that I committed acts of indecency with him there. He never went to the Savoy with me at all and had supper there. It's true that he dined with me, the rest is untrue.
Alfred Wood.
It is entirely untrue that he ever went to Tite Street with me at all.
Fred Atkins.
It is not true where he says he came and saw me with Mr. Schwab in bed. Mr. Schwab was in Paris. It is true that Atkins slept in the room he described next to mine. The rest is untrue.
Why did you ask Sidney Maver to spend the night with you at the Albemarle?
As company for me and a compliment for himself.
From Oscar Wilde, a summing up by Lord Alfred Douglas.
It would have been infinitely better if Oscar had told the truth. Of course, to do this would have had him take the chance of striking a blow for saying what he really thought and passionately believed.
The cross-examination of Oscar Wilde by Mr. Charles Gill.
Mr. Wilde, why did you take up with these youths?
I'm a lover of youth.
You exalt youth as a sort of god.
I like to study the youth in everything. I find something fascinating in youthfulness.
How old was Lord Alfred Douglas when you met him?
20 years old.
In your correspondence with Lord Alfred Douglas, you refer to your undying love for him. You also say that he is the divine thing that you want. Is that a decent way to address a young man?
It is a beautiful way to address
Is
a
it
young
decent?
man. Oh, decent? Of course it is decent.
Is it? Do you understand the meaning of the words, sir?
Yes.
Did Lord Alfred Douglas contribute some verses to the communion?
Yes.
The two poems in question were somewhat peculiar.
Well, they certainly were not mere commonplaces, like so much that is labeled poetry.
You described them as beautiful poems.
I said something tantamount to that. I found them creative in theme and construction, and I admired them.
The following poem is called Two Loves. In it, two boys meet. One boy says, I am the love, or I am true love. I fill the hearts of boy and girl with mutual flame. Then sighing, the other says, have thy will. I am the love that dare not speak its name. Was that poem explained to you?
I think it is clear.
Well, there's no question as to what it means.
Most certainly not.
Well, is it not clear that the love described relates to natural and unnatural love?
No.
What is the love that dare not speak its name?
The love that dare not speak its name. In this century is such a great affection of an elder for a younger man as there was between David and Jonathan, such as Plato made the very basis of his philosophy, and such as you find in the sonnets of Michelangelo and Shakespeare. It is a deep spiritual affection that is as pure as it is perfect. It dictates and pervades great works of art like those of Shakespeare and Michelangelo and those two letters of mine, such as they are. It is, in this century, misunderstood. So much misunderstood that it may be described as the love that dare not speak its name, and on account of it I am placed where I am now. It is beautiful. It is fine. It is the noblest form of affection. There is nothing unnatural about it. It is intellectual, and it repeatedly exists between an elder and a younger man, when the elder man has intellect, and the younger man has all the joy, hope, and glamour of life before him. That it should be so, the world does not understand. The world mocks at it, and sometimes puts one in the pillory for it.
Manifestation of feeling, I shall have the course clear. Complete silence must be preserved.
With regard to your friendship towards these men who have given evidence, may I take it was, as you described, Mr. Wilde, the deep affection of an elder man for a younger?
Certainly not. That happens once in one's life and only once towards anybody.
From the autobiography of Lord Alfred Douglas.
I am proud to have been loved by a great poet. There will always be 1,000 Queensberry for one, Oscar Wilde.
Nothing more with this witness.
Gentlemen of the jury, I have received a communication that you were unable.
That
Is
is,
this an agreement?
that is so, my lord.
Is there any prospect that if you retire to your room, you would be able to come to an agreement?
I put that also to my fellow jurymen. We considered the matter for 3 hours, and we cannot agree.
That being so, I do not feel justified in detaining you any longer. The prisoner will be held in prison until further notice. I will counsel in my chambers to set the date for the next trial. The court is adjourned.
Sir Edward Clark applied for bail, and it was refused by the trial judge. Wilde was imprisoned again. 4 days later, Clark applied again for bail, and it was granted by another judge in the extortionate sum of £5,000 from Oscar Wilde by Robert Sherrard. Wilde went to the Midland Hotel, and dinner was ordered. No sooner had he sat down than the hotel manager came in and said,
You are Oscar Wilde, I believe.
Yes.
You must leave this hotel at once.
From this hotel, he went to another on the outskirts of London. He sank down exhausted on the bed of the room. The landlord appeared.
Sir, I am sorry, but you've been followed by a band of prize fighters. They say they will sack the house and raise the street if you stay here a moment longer. I must insist that you leave.
At last, after midnight, he arrived at his mother's house in Oakley Street.
Give me shelter, Willie. Let me lie on the floors, or I shall die in the streets.
Come in, his brother Willie. Thank God my vices are decent. Frank Harris came to see him in Oakley Street the following morning.
I feel that public disgrace is in store for me. I feel certain of it. I never knew what terror was before, but I know it now. It is as if one's hand of ice were laid upon one's heart. It's as if one's heart were beating itself to death in some empty hollow.
Oscar, I have a yacht waiting to take you to France. You must go.
I can't, Frank. I can't.
Listen, Oscar, I will not cross my arms and let that band of crooks get the best of you.
Oh, Frank. You speak with passion and conviction. As if I were innocent.
But you are innocent, aren't you?
No, Frank. I thought you knew that all along. This will make a great difference to you, Frank.
No. I didn't know. I did not believe the accusation. I didn't believe it for a moment. I thought that men confuse the artistic nature with that vice, but...
What you call vice, Frank, is not vice. It has been good to me. Will this make a great difference to you, Frank?
No. Curiously enough, it has made no difference to me at all. I don't know why. I suppose I've got more sympathy in me than morality. It has surprised me. It dumbfounded me. The thing has always seemed fantastic and incredible to me, but now you make it exist for me. But it has no effect on my friendship. It has no effect on my resolve to help you.
You have been a good friend to me, Frank. A thoroughly good friend.
I don't know I've been able to do much for you. In fact, I haven't been able to do anything for you. I'm thoroughly disappointed in myself.
You have enabled me to tell the truth to you, Frank. That is something. To speak the truth is a painful thing. To be forced to tell lies is much worse.
Well, now I must take you away immediately.
Oh, Frank, that would be wonderful, but it is impossible. I should be arrested before I left London. The crowd would boo at me, and I would be disgraced and insulted again. I could not bear it. I could not risk that.
Nonsense! I believe the authorities would be only too glad if you went.
I don't think so, Frank. I couldn't do it.
Oscar, if you go, I'm quite willing to take half of the debt on my shoulders, and you can pay the other half, or 1,000 or so, within a very short time by writing a couple of plays. American papers would be only too glad to pay you for an interview. The story of your escape would be worth thousands. Leave everything to me.
Wilde's family had other opinions. His brother, "You're an Irishman. You must stay and face the music." His mother,
If you stay, no matter what happens, you'll always be my son. If you leave, I shall never talk to you again.
his wife.
You must go, Oscar.
A letter from Oscar Wilde to Bosie on the eve of his third trial.
I have decided that it is nobler and more beautiful to stay. We cannot be together. I do not want to be called a coward or a deserter, a false name, a disguise, a hunted life. All that is not for me. O sweetest of all boys, most loved of all loves, in all the worlds of pain and pleasure, you are my ideal of admiration and joy.
From the autobiography of Lord Alfred Douglas.
I don't like to think of it, but I've thought since 100 times that it was an insane thing not to go. That really leaving would have been a braver thing to do.
An official announcement. The next trial will not be led by Mr. Gill. The Crown is naming Frank Lockwood, the Solicitor General, as the counsel for the prosecution.
From a letter sent to Douglas from the French magazine Mercure de France. The third trial is a result of a political intrigue. The government does not wish to let the prosecution of Oscar Wilde take its regular course.
From Oscar Wilde by H. Montgomery High. Carson, who had refused to be the Crown's prosecutor against Wilde, now went to Lockwood instead.
Cannot you let up on the fellow now? The jury was deadlocked, Frank.
I would, but we cannot. We dare not. It would be said, both in England and abroad, that it was owing to the nature of this case that we were forced to abandon it.
The government is intimidated. The fact is that the little party presently contains a large number of men that have the same inclinations as Wilde does. People are talking about them. To hush up these rumors, Oscar must be found guilty.
Wilde has suffered a great deal. In addition, he has already spent over a month in prison without the possibility of bail, just awaiting a trial.
I would wish to ask the Home Security this. Is it not true that you've been threatened by the Prime Minister that if a second trial is not instituted and a verdict of guilty obtained against Mr. Wilde, the Liberal Party would be removed from power?
I can't, Edward. It would be seen as an act of weakness. Besides, many people in this government are implicated in similar affairs. It would be said that it was owing to those people that we were forced to abandon the case. We must go on until the end.
It is a grating coup d'etat, a sacrifice of great hope to save a degraded band of politicians. The Mercure de France refused to publish Douglas's letters.
The third trial, Old Bailey Central Criminal Court, Regina versus Wilde.
I am bound to assume that, as you are an entirely fresh jury, you are totally ignorant of the facts which have been elucidated in the previous trial of the prisoner. It will therefore be necessary to go through the entire case again in detail. The defendant is charged with having committed offenses under Section 2 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, gross indecency with male persons.
He has repeatedly used his influence to corrupt young men of quite inferior station. He led these men into the most vicious and depraved conduct from day profundus.
I remember sitting in the dock of my last trial, listening to Locke's appalling denunciation of me, like a thing out of Tacitus, a passage in Dante, being sick and poor at what I heard.
That Wilde has been at the center of a circle of hideous corruption among young men, it is impossible
My
to
name is
doubt.
Charles Parker today. Mr. Wilde committed sodomy.
I must say to myself that I ruined myself, and that nobody great or small can be ruined except by their own hand. This pitiless indictment I bring without pity against myself. I let myself be lured to prolonged spells of senseless and sensual ease.
My name is Alfred Wood. I'm 22 years old. Mr.
I
Wilde.
surrounded myself with the smaller natures and the meaner minds. I became a spendthrift with my own genius. I took pleasure where it pleased me and passed on.
My name is Fred Atkins. I'm 20 years old. 3 times, Mr.
I
Wilde.
forgot that every little action of the common day makes or unmakes character, and that what one does in the secret chamber, one has one day to cry aloud on the housetops.
I am the brother of Charles Parker. My brother accepted a preserved cherry from Wilde's own mouth.
I blame myself terribly. As I sit here a ruined man, it is myself I blame.
I am the landlady. The windows were never cleaned or opened, and the daylight was never admitted.
While there is nothing wrong in what I did, there is something wrong in what I became.
I'm a waiter at a private hotel at 10 St. James Place. A number of young men of quite inferior station called there to see Wilde.
How weary I am of the whole thing, of the shame and the struggling and the hatred. To see those people coming into the box one after the other to testify against me makes me sick.
I am a silversmith. I supplied Mr. Wilde with silver cigarette cases.
Reason does not help me. It tells me that the law under which I'm being judged is a wrong and unjust law, and the system under which I'm being judged a wrong and unfair system.
I am the housekeeper. After Mr. Wilde's visits, the sheets were stained in a peculiar way.
The world is growing more tolerant. One day you will be ashamed of your treatment of me.
I am professor of massage. Once I saw a young man in bed with Mr. Wilde. I never attended Mr. Wilde again.
I feel inclined to stretch out my arms and to cry out, "Do what you will with me in God's name, only do it quickly." Can you not see I'm worn out? If hatred gives you pleasure, indulge it.
When did your acquaintance with Lord Alfred Douglas first begin?
In 1892.
And when did the Marquis of Queensberry first object?
In April 1894.
Mr. Wilde, where is Lord Alfred Queensberry now?
He is abroad.
Where?
In Paris, at the Hotel des Deux Mondes.
And of course you have been in communication with him?
Certainly. These accusations are founded on sand. Our friendship is founded on a rock. There has been no need to cancel the acquaintance.
This is from the now notorious prose poem that you wrote to Lord Alfred Douglas. My own dear boy. Why did you choose the words, my own dear boy?
My dearest boy.
A letter from Oscar Wilde to Lord Alfred Douglas from Holloway Prison on the last night of the trial.
This is to assure you of my immortal, my eternal love for you. Tomorrow all will be over.
If prison and dishonor be my destiny, think that my love for you and this idea, this still more divine belief that you love me in return will sustain me in my unhappiness and will make me capable of, I hope, bearing my grief most patiently.
Since the hope, nay, the certainty of meeting you again in some world is the present goal and encouragement of my life, I must live in this world because of it.
Is that a decent way to address a young man?
I am so glad you fought away. I know what that must have cost you. It would have been agony for me to think that you were in England when your name was mentioned in court.
Were you speaking of love between men?
I hope you have copies of all my books. All mine have been sold. I stretch out my arms to you to touch your hair and your face again. I feel certain that your love will watch over my life. Try to let me hear from you soon.
Was it sensual love?
This last day in court has Wait for me!
Wait for me. I am now, ever since the day we met, yours devotedly, and with the more to love. Oscar.
What was the charge which Lord Queensberry made against you?
Posing sodomite.
Gentlemen of the jury, this case is a most difficult one, and my task very severe.
I would rather try the most shocking murder case that has ever fallen to my lot than to try a case of this description.
It is a case which, notwithstanding the horrible nature of the charge involved, calls for the resolute administration of justice.
Oscar Wilde is an artist who exercised considerable influence over young men.
He has used his art to subvert morality and cause unnatural vice.
I was a man who stood in symbolic relation to the art and culture of my age. Few men hold such a position in their own lifetimes and have it so acknowledged. I had genius, a distinguished name, high social position, brilliancy, intellectual daring. I made art a philosophy, and philosophy an art. I altered the minds of men and the colors of things. There was nothing that I did not say or do that did not make them wonder. Whatever I touched, I made beautiful in a new mode of beauty. I treated art as a supreme reality in life, as a mere mode of fiction. I awoke the imagination of the century around me so that it created myth and legend around me. I summed up all systems in a phrase, and all existence in an epigram.
Gentlemen, have you agreed upon a verdict?
Yes, we have.
And do you find the prisoner at the bar guilty or not guilty of grossness indecency?
We find him guilty, my lord.
Oscar Wilde, the crime of which you have been convicted, is so bad that one has to put a firm restraint upon oneself in describing, in words I would rather not use, the sentiments which must rise to the breast of every man of honor who has heard the details of these 3 terrible trials. It is no use for me to address you. People who can do these things are dead to all sense of shame, and one cannot hope to produce any effect upon them. I shall under such circumstances be expected to pass the severe sentence allowed by the law. It is in my opinion totally inadequate for such a case as this. The sentence of the court is that you be imprisoned and kept to hard labor for 2 years.
And may I say nothing, my lord?
His lordship made no reply, aside from a wave of the hand to the warders, as they hurried the prisoner out of sight.
The jury is discharged. The court is adjourned.
The press lived up to Wilde's expectation by almost universally loving the verdict. Daily Telegraph.
Open the windows, let in the fresh air.
The news of the world.
The aesthetic cult is over.
The St. James Gazette.
A dash of wholesome bigotry is better than over-toleration.
Oscar Wilde spent the next 2 years in prison. During this time, his wife changed her name and the name of their children. Also during this time, he fell in his cell and injured his ear. This was to deteriorate and be the cause of his death 3 years later. During this time in jail, he turned against Lord Alfred Douglas and wrote, in the Ballad of Reading Jail, "For each man that kills the thing he loves." Lord Alfred asked him what he meant by this, and Oscar replied, "I want to know."
After his release from prison, Oscar Wilde left for France, where he lived under an assumed name in exile and poverty for the rest of his life.
He never saw his wife or children again.
He never wrote another play.
Oscar Wilde died on the 30th of November, 1900. He was buried at Bagneux Cemetery 4 days later. Lord Alfred Douglas was one of 12 people to attend the burial.
After Wilde's death, Lord Alfred Douglas became a Catholic, married and had 2 children. He later repudiated his association with Oscar Wilde.
The Marquis of Queensberry died in 1899, a pathetic victim of persecution mania, convinced to the last that he was being carried to the tomb of Oscar Wilde, as he called his imaginary tormentor.
By 1908, Oscar Wilde's plays were being performed in every European language.
By 1920, Oscar Wilde was, after Shakespeare, the most widely read English author in Europe. This is from a prose poem written by Oscar Wilde the year of his release from prison. It is called The House of Judgment.
And there was silence in the house of judgment. And the man came naked before God. And God opened the book of the life of the man. And God said to the man,
Thy life hath been evil. Thou hast shown cruelty to those who are in need of succor, and to those who lacked help. Thou hast been bitter and hard of heart.
The poor called to thee, and thine ears were closed to the cry of my afflicted.
And the man made answer and said,
Even so did I.
And again God opened the book of the life of the man. And God said to the man,
Thou hast eaten of the thing that must not be eaten. Thine idols were gold or silver that endure, but of flesh that dieth.
Thou didst stain their hair with perfumes, and put pomegranates in their hands. Thou didst stain their feet with saffron, and lay carpets before them.
And the man made answer and said,
Even so did I.
And the third time God opened the book of the life of the man. And God said to the man, Evil hath been thy life, and with evil didst thou requite good, and with wrongdoing kindness.
He who came to thee with water went away thirsty.
And to those who came to thee with love went away with lust in thy turn.
And the man made answer and said,
Even so did I.
And God closed the book of the life of the man. And God said to the man, Then surely I will send thee into hell, even into hell will I send thee. And the man cried out,
Thou canst not.
And God said to the man, Wherefore can I not send thee into hell? And for what reason?
Because in hell I have always lived.
Answered the man. And there was silence in the house of judgment. And after a space God spake and said,
Then surely I will send thee unto heaven, even unto heaven will I send thee.
And the man cried out,
Thou canst not.
And God said to the man,
Wherefore can I not send thee unto heaven, and for what reason?
Because never and in no place have I been able to imagine it.
Answered the man, and there was silence in the house of judgment.
The third trial, Old Bailey Central Criminal Court, Regina versus Wilde.
I am bound to assume that as you are an entirely fresh jury, you are totally ignorant of the facts which have been elucidated in the previous trial of the prisoner. It will therefore be necessary to go through the entire case again in detail. The defendant is charged with having committed offenses under Section 2 of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, gross indecency with male persons. He has repeatedly used his influence to corrupt young men of quite inferior station. He led these men into the most vicious and depraved conduct. From De Profundis.
I remember sitting in the dock on the last day of my trial, listening to Lockwood's appalling denunciation of me, like a thing out of Tacitus, a passage in Dante, and being sickened with horror at what I heard.
That Wilde has been at the center of a circle of hideous corruption among young men, it is impossible to doubt.
My name is Charles Parker. I am 21 years of age. Mr. Wilde committed
I
sodomy
must
with me
say to
on...
myself that I ruined myself, and that no way great or small can be ruined except by their own hand. This pitiless indictment I bring without pity against myself. I let myself be lured into long spells of senseless and sensual ease.
My name is Alfred Wood. I'm 22 years old. Mr.
I
Wilde.
surrounded myself with the meaner natures and the smaller minds. I became a spendthrift of my own genius. I grew careless of the lives of others. I took pleasure where it pleased me and passed on.
My name is Fred Atkins. I'm 20 years old. Three
I
times,
forgot
Mr. Wilde.
that every little action of the common day makes or unmakes character, and that what one does in the secret chamber one has someday to cry aloud on the housetops.
The Crown will produce witnesses that will on oath state that...
I am the brother of Charles Parker. My brother accepted a preserved cherry from Wilde's own mouth.
I blame myself terribly. As I sit here, a ruined man, it is myself I blame.
I'm the landlady. The windows were never opened or cleaned, and the daylight was never admitted.
Well, there is nothing wrong in what I did. There is something wrong in and what I became.
I am a waiter at a private hotel at 10 St. James Place. A number of young men of quite inferior station called there to see Wilde.
How weary I am of the whole thing, of the shame and the struggling and the hatred. To see those people coming into the box one after the other to testify against me makes me sick.
I am the silversmith. I supplied Mr. Wilde with silver cigarette cases.
Reason does not help me. It tells me that the law under which I am being judged is a wrong and unfair law, and the system under which I am being judged a wrong and unjust system.
I am the housekeeper. After Mr. Wilde's visits, the sheets were stained in a peculiar way.
The world is growing more tolerant. One day you will be ashamed of your treatment of me.
I am professor of massage. Once I saw a young man in bed with Mr. Wilde. I never attended Mr. Wilde again.
I feel inclined to stretch out my arms and to cry out, do what you will with me in God's name. Only do it quickly. Can you not see I'm worn out? If hatred gives you pleasure, indulge it.
When did your acquaintance with Lord Alfred Queensberry begin?
In 1892.
And when did the Marquis of Queensberry first object?
In April 1894.
Mr. Wilde, where is Lord Alfred now?
He is abroad.
Where?
In Paris, at the Hotel de Beaumont.
Of course you have been in communication with him.
Certainly. These charges are founded on sand. Our friendship is founded on a rock. There has been no need to cancel the acquaintance.
This is from the now notorious prose poem that you wrote to Lord Alfred. My own dear boy. Why did you choose those words, my own dear boy?
My dearest boy.
A letter from Oscar Wilde, written to Lord Alfred Douglas on the final nights of the trial from Holloway Prison.
This is to assure you of my immortal, my eternal love for you. One day through tomorrow, all will be over.
If prison and dishonor be my destiny, think that my love for you and this idea, this still more divine belief that you love me in return will sustain me in my unhappiness and will make me capable, I hope, of bearing my grief most patiently.
Since the hope, nay, the certainty of seeing you again in some world is the current goal and encouragement of my present life, I must continue to live in this world because of it.
Was it a decent way to address a young man?
I am so happy you've gone away. It would have been agony for me to think that your name was mentioned in court with you in England.
Were you speaking of love between men?
I hope you have copies of all my books. All mine have been sold. Dearest boy, sweetest, I feel certain that your love will watch over my life. Try and let me hear from you soon.
Was it sensual love?
Sweetest of all, young one, most loving, most lovable, wait for me!
Wait for me. I am now, ever since the day we met, yours devotedly and with an immortal love. Oscar.
What was the charge which Lord Queensberry made against you?
Posing sodomite!
Gentlemen of the jury, this case is a most difficult one, and my task very severe.
I would rather try the most shocking murder case that has ever fallen my lot than be engaged in the case of this description.
It is a case which, notwithstanding the nature of the charges involved, calls for the resolute administration of justice.
Oscar Wilde is an artist who exercised considerable influence over young men.
He has used his art to subvert morality and cause unnatural vice.
I was a man who stood in symbolic relation to the art and culture of my age. Few men hold such a position in their own lifetimes and have it so acknowledged. I had genius, a high distinguished name, high social position, brilliancy, intellectual daring. I made art of philosophy, and philosophy an art. I altered the minds of men and the colors of things. There was nothing I said or did that did not
verdict?
Yes, we have.
Do you find the prisoner at the bar guilty or not guilty of gross indecency?
We find him guilty, my lord.
Oscar Wilde. The crime of which we've been convicted is so bad that one has to put a firm restraint upon oneself, prevent oneself from describing, in terms I would rather not use, the sentiments which must rise to the breast of every man who has heard the details of these 3 terrible trials. It is no use for me to address you. People who can do these things are dead to all sense of shame, and one cannot hope to produce any effect upon them. I shall under such circumstances be expected to pass the severe sentence allowed by the law. The sentence of the court is that you be imprisoned and kept to hard labor for 2 years.
And I? May I say nothing, my lord?
His lordship made no reply aside from a wave of the hand to the warders, who hurried the prisoner out of sight.
The jury is discharged. The court is adjourned.
The press lived up to Wilde's reputation by almost universally praising the verdict. The Daily Telegraph.
Open the windows. Let in the fresh air.
The news of the world.
The aesthetic cult is over.
The St. James Gazette.
A dash of wholesome bigotry is better than over-toleration.
Oscar Wilde spent the next 2 years in prison. During this time, his wife changed her name in the name of their children. Also, during this time, he fell in his cell, injured his ear. This was to deteriorate and be the cause of his death 3 years later. Also during this time, he wrote The Ballad of Reading Gaol, which contains the lines, "For each man kills the things he loves." Lord Alfred Douglas asked him what he meant by this. He said, "You ought to know."
After his release from prison, Wilde moved to France, where he lived under an assumed name in poverty and exile for the rest of his life.
He never saw his wife or children again.
He never wrote another play.
Oscar Wilde died on the 30th of November, 1900. He was buried at Bagnham Cemetery 4 days later. Lord Alfred Douglas was one of 12 people to attend the burial.
After Wilde's death, Lord Alfred Douglas became a Catholic, married and had 2 children. He later repudiated his association with Oscar Wilde.
The Marquis of Queensberry died in 1899, a pathetic victim of persecution mania, convinced to the last that he was being carried to the tomb of Oscar Wilders, as he used to refer to his imaginary tormentors.
By 1908, all of Oscar Wilde's plays were being performed in every European language.
By 1920, Oscar Wilde was, after Shakespeare, the most widely read English author in Europe. This is from a prose poem written by Oscar Wilde a year after his release from prison. It is called The House of Judgment.
And there was silence in the house of judgment, and the man came naked before God. And God opened the book of the life of the man, and God said to the man,
Thy life hath been evil. Thou hast shown cruelty to those who are in need of succor, and to those who lacked help thou hast been bitter and hard of heart.
The poor called to thee, and shine ears were closed to the cry of my afflicted.
And the man made answer and said,
Even so did I.
And again God opened the book of the life of the man, and God said to the man,
Thou hast eaten of the thing that must not be eaten. Thine idols were neither of gold nor silver that endure, but of flesh that dieth.
Thou didst stain their hair with perfumes, and put pomegranates in their hands. Thou didst stain their feet with saffron, and laid carpets before them.
And the man made answer and said,
Even so did I.
And a third time God opened the book of the life of the man, and God said to the man, Evil hath been thy life, and with evil didst thou requite good, and with wrongdoing kindness.
He who came to thee with water went away thirsty.
And to those who came to thee with love, went away with lust in thy turn.
And the man made answer and said,
Even so did I.
And God closed the book of the life of the man. And God said to the man, Surely I will send thee into hell, even into hell will I send thee. And the man cried out,
Thou canst not.
And God said to the man, Wherefore can I not send thee into hell, and for what reason?
Because in hell I have always lived.
Answered the man. And there was silence in the house of judgment. And after a space God spake and said,
Then surely I will send thee unto heaven, even unto heaven will I send thee.
And the man cried out,
Thou canst not.
And God said to the man,
Wherefore can I not send thee unto heaven, and for what reason?
Because never and in no place have I been able to imagine it.
Answered the man. And there was silence in the house of judgment.